Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one we have several Russian advances all across the eastern section of the front line, from Kupiansk in the north through the Oskil River line in the Toretsk direction. In the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the direction of the northern flank of Kharkov, and in the western flank of the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the direction of the northern flank of Kharkov, and in the western flank of Velika Novosilka in the direction of Remivka. The Russians have also advanced in the southern flank of Sucha, while the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations with the new offensive in the Kursk region. We see significant developments all across the front line as both sides continue their offensive operations, and the Ukrainians are yet again betting on another Kursk offensive. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see that the Ukrainians have managed to advance towards Kruklik from multiple directions. They are advancing from the southern flank and the northern flank, trying to pincer the Russian positions within the settlement and to push them away from it. This is to create a buffer zone between the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces here in the northern parts of the Kursk incursion, and to improve their positions ahead of an assault towards the next strategic town here in the direction of Kursk itself, and that is Bolshoe Soldatskoye. It is one of the main supply hubs for the Russian forces in this section of the front line. From it, the Russians are staging offensive operations towards Martinovka and the northern flank of Sucha. It is the one that allows the Russians to operate in this area in its entirety. Therefore, the Ukrainians are very interested in gaining control of it. This would limit the Russian offensive capabilities in the area and push them back towards the defensive line they've built south of Lvov. So this seems to be the main target for the Ukrainian offensive this time around. So far, they have failed to capture a single settlement in the first day of fighting. The fighting started at 9 a.m. this morning, and it is now 11:45. The Ukrainians managed to push the Russians to the outskirts of Cherkaskoye, Poreshnoe. This means that they will likely gain full control over that soon. At the same time, they got a foothold in the southern outskirts of Beredin and have gained control of about half of Novosotnitsky. With this, the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations with armored convoys, such as what we see in this video here, where they have several armored vehicles, tanks, and infantry fighting vehicles to transport troops and to hit the Russian front line. And at the same time, we also see the Russians mainly responding with FPV drones, where we see, for example, this footage here of an FPV drone striking a Challenger tank in the Kursk region. The Russians, in turn, are focusing on the flanks of the Ukrainians. Their objective is to gain control over Sucha. They are attacking from the south of Sucha through Makhnovka and Dmitrievkov, where we see the geolocated footage of the advance of the Russian forces here in the southern flank of Sucha. If the Russians gain control over Sucha, forget about the Ukrainian offensive. The entire Ukrainian Kursk incursion is in danger of complete encirclement. The Russians gain control over Sucha would cut the direct road between the Ukrainian forces and their current ongoing offensive. Therefore, it is very dangerous for the Ukrainians to be launching this offensive while their southern flank is exposed in its entirety. The hope of the Ukrainians could be that the Russians would redirect their forces from the Sucha direction up to the northern direction, or that the northern direction is exposed due to the Russian offensive operations in the southern flank. In either case, we will see, and time will tell, whether the Russians will succeed in the capture of Sucha, the Ukrainians will succeed with the capture of Bolshoe Soldatskoye, or if it will re-enter a stalemate situation where incremental gains will be gained by either side. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have expanded their foothold across the Oskil River line, their bridgehead further in a southern direction, bypassing Zapatne and looking to gain control over the road. This will isolate Zapatne completely. This will allow the Russians to gain control over Zapatne and then push towards the Orishne in the north and Kupiansk in the south. It is likely that the Russians, with the success they are seeing in this section of the front line, plan on expanding their operations here and push towards gaining a proper bridgehead across with a stable supply line and to gain control over settlements such as Toretsk and Kupiansk, which are important logistical hubs for the western bank of the Oskil River line. Further south, the Russians have managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Ivanivka, getting control over the settlement and the fortified positions near to the south. This allowed the Russians to now have a proper bridgehead across. It is also fairly isolated from other settlements. This means that the Russians can launch offensive operations on the western bank of the Serbets River line, whether it is towards Bilorivka, Kulodyasi, or Novolyubivka to the north. These are now exposed from the southern flank or northern flank from Ivanivka. The Russians can also now secure the positions near Novosadova and Terny, allow for drone operators to operate from these settlements, and improve the combat strength of the Russian forces near the front line. Further south, the Russians have expanded their positions within Toretsk itself, where they are advancing towards the western outskirts of the settlement, as we see with this geolocated footage here. The Russians continue their offensive operations all across the front line, where they are now focusing on gaining full control over Toretsk. We see that with these several advances all across the Toretsk section of the front line. And as mentioned in the previous video, this will allow the Russians to advance further towards Konstantinivka in the north, reach the reservoir, push towards the western side, cut off the main highway from Konstantinivka to the defensive area north of Avdiivka, and with the recent pushes by the Russians northwest of Ocheretina, they would be able to cut off the other supply road, and that would completely encircle the Ukrainian forces in this entire pocket, which consists of several settlements and a load of fortified positions for the Ukrainians. Them losing this significant portion of the front line north of Avdiivka will secure the front line for the Russians for a push towards Konstantinivka from the south. The highway between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, cutting off the supply road between the two sides, and allowing the Russians to focus more of their strength towards the city of Pokrovsk in the western section of the front line. Within Toretsk itself, there is only one small industrial area remaining under Ukrainian control. Following that, there will be some fighting over these smaller areas, which are small outposts and high ground alongside them. And finally, the fortified positions located on the high ground northwest of Toretsk, with the push coming towards Shcherbinivka. The Russians are looking to flank them from the rear through the capture of Shcherbinivka. With the river line on the west flank, the Russians would be able to advance alongside the railways towards the rear of the fortified positions and gain control over those as well. This will allow the Russians to gain full control over the city of Toretsk and the surrounding areas. The Russians are also continuing offensive operations near Yelisavetivka, where they've managed to secure the road towards the settlement and are fighting within the settlement itself, where despite the Ukrainian armored losses, they are continuing to fight over the settlement. And this shows exactly my point from the earlier video, where the Ukrainians lost a settlement to two Russian soldiers that simply walked in unopposed. There was not a single Ukrainian soldier within the settlement. And then we see other settlements like Yelisavetivka, where the Ukrainians sent several armored vehicles, a lot of infantry, a lot of their forces to defend. And that explains exactly how some settlements are captured by Russian forces within a single day, while others have to take several days or even weeks to be fought over for the Russians to capture it. It all depends on how many soldiers the Ukrainians send, how much equipment they use, and how much artillery fire, FPV drones, and so on that they have available to defend these settlements. If none of them are present, then it will simply be lost quickly. If there's a lot of forces and resistance, then they will be able to hold on to it for a longer time before the Russians capture it. The Russians have managed to secure the area in between Petropavlivka and Shevchenko in the northern flank of Kurakhove, capturing several fortified positions of the Ukrainians and pushing further towards Andriivka. The Russians did a copy of exactly what they did near Sansivka, where they captured Sansivka in the north and Staria Terny in the south before they closed the pocket in between the two sides. This reduced a lot of the manpower of the Ukrainians in this section of the front line and the equipment that they had available. This led to rapid advances by the Russians in the western direction towards Shevchenko and Petropavlivka. Despite the fortified positions available, with no people to defend them, the Russians captured them quickly, and over just 2 days, the Russians captured Petropavlivka and Shevchenko and the fortified positions in between them, and are now advancing further towards Andriivka itself. Finally, in the direction of Velika Novoselka, the Russians are flanking Vremivka from the western direction, hitting the supply road in and out of Neskushne, between Neskushne and Vremivka. This is the only supply road that is allowed to supply Neskushne, and the Russians are now just a couple of 100 meters away. With the capture of the fortified positions and the high ground, the Ukrainians will likely withdraw from Neskushne into Vremivka, to which the process the Russians will be attacking the Ukrainian positions. With the control over the road in the western direction as well, it is very limited how many supplies can come in and out of Velika Novoselka, Vremivka and Neskushne, and this means that the Ukrainian positions are extremely vulnerable, and with this push towards Vremivka, the Ukrainians are forced to make a choice. Will they stand a last stand within Neskushne and Vremivka, or will they withdraw to Velika Novoselka and out of this pocket before they get encircled, like the fate of the Ukrainian soldiers in the direction of Kursk in the southern flank of it and in the northern flank of it, which is leading to additional Russian advances because of the lack of Ukrainian soldiers to defend these areas. We see an increased number of encirclements by the Russian forces, and this is mainly due to the Ukrainian command never giving the order to withdraw. The Ukrainian groupings have to withdraw themselves, otherwise they will never be withdrawn and will only have to do a last stand one after another, and this leads to sometimes the Ukrainians withdraw, which leads to an unopposed Russian capture of a settlement, or they'll do a last stand, which means that the forces are wiped out and the Russians just simply capture the next settlement one after another until additional reinforcements arrive and the Ukrainian defensive capabilities are weakened further. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.